I wanted to check on you. Make sure you're okay.
You know what it feels like to get beaten almost to death? Peaceful. It feels peaceful. It was like I was floating away, watching the whole thing happen to me. And then I woke up again, and nothing's changed. I'm still taking a beating. Every day. Duck, Katja, Sarita. No peace. No rest. The punches just keep coming. Why the hell couldn't Carver have just finished me off? Obviously, I ain't helping anyone by being here.
That's not true. You help me. All the time. I need you.
I've seen you take care of yourself more than any 3 adults put together. But, thanks for saying that.
So Kenny in particular is one of those characters in Telltales The Walking Dead that's really complex, so much so that his character is one where you can't exactly easily talk about without really getting deep within the story. Within the story though, Kenny as a person shows a lot of ups and downs within himself, not so much in a way in which is negative, but more so expressing how himself as a character is flawed in a positive way. With this, I want to explain why I think Kenny is the best flawed character in Telltales The Walking Dead. Now, our first interactions with Kenny are at Hershel's farm, where after Lee and Clementine escaped from Clementine's home from walkers and took shelter from the Herschels, Kenny introduces himself to Lee and Clementine. As typical introductions go, Kenny explains how him and his family took shelter at Hershel's, this also introducing his family as well, Katja his wife and Duck his son. Kenny, from when we first get introduced to him and later on in season 1, portrays pretty well that he's very family oriented, saying that's what really matters above all things, as well as doing what's best for his family and others. From hanging around with Kenny, you would also take note that Kenny is very emotional when it comes to certain things, like for instance not always agreeing on the same things, leading Kenny to be quite stubborn and hard to deal with. His ultimate care for his family is shown quite a few times. One example is him defending his son from Larry's accusations that he was bit, despite not being the case. From this, it would seem to us that Kenny is an all-around good dude who wants to do the best for his family and for the people that he cares about. With this though, we slowly start to see the shift in his character towards the start of episode 3. For episode 3, this episode in season 1 is known pretty heavily to be the part of the story where everything goes downhill for the group. But for some, even worse, in which Kenny is one of them. The episode goes downhill as the group gets raided by the bandits, which the group escape in the RV. After the situation with Lily where she shoots Carly for a remark she made and thinking that she was the one that was sneaking supplies to the bandits, we get informed by Kenny and Katja that apparently Duck got bit during the raid. From this point on starts the shift in development in Kenny's character throughout the rest of season 1. Now the group end up finding a freight train and thus try to see if they can get it to work, that way they can get to Savannah. The group successfully get it to work. Though you see the small victories, you can see Kenny slowly going into denial of the fact that his son is dying and will die if he doesn't deal with the problem. Which clearly, seeing as the group are moving along the tracks, you can witness Kenny firsthand, showing that he ultimately doesn't want to believe that what is happening is truly happening. What's interesting is the conversation where Lee is trying to persuade Kenny in stopping the train for Duck. He mentions that he feels as though he deserves it since he believes that it was his fault that Sean Greene's death was because of him, and that also his son getting bit was his doing.
You think you're the reason Duck was bitten? Like you had this coming or something? You didn't kill Hershel's son.
Yes, I did. And now it's catching up to me.
That's not what went down. You looked out for your kid, and a bad thing happened to someone else's.
There ain't no way this world lets my son live when I help put someone else's in the ground.
That's not the way it works. You know that. Stop the train, man.
Eventually though, Kenny does stop the train and him and Katja decide to say their goodbyes to Duck as they know full well that they have to put him out of his misery. Kenny and Katja take Duck into the woods to prevent Clementine from seeing, but not too long after them walking into the woods, we hear a gunshot. Lee rushes into the woods to see what happened, and sad enough we see that Katja took herself out, not wanting to deal with the pain of losing her child. Kenny, mourning, rightfully so, questions what should they do with Duck. Lee and Kenny both realize that they have to shoot Duck, and so they do. Right here in this moment is the moment where Kenny lost his purpose, What I mean by this is that Kenny, like I said earlier, was very family oriented, willing to do anything to keep his family safe, anything he can as a father and a husband to do what's best for their well-being and ultimately provide as much as he can for them. But for them to be gone just like that, Kenny outright feels as though from himself failed. In his heart, he failed as a father, failed as a husband, and overall failed at protecting the only things that he cared about for in this dying world, his family. And for him to lose them, he lost his purpose, and so from this point forward, he's directionless. Even though Kenny says that they'll find a boat in Savannah multiple times, Kenny ultimately doesn't know what to do with himself. As you can see, throughout the rest of the season, he's very broken down and unmotivated. But one of the things that you see in Kenny towards the latter half of the story is that he becomes sensitive to things that remind him of family. What I mean is that there's a few times within the story where Kenny had to deal with whether his own or other people's family, more specifically sons. You had the incident with Greene where Kenny felt guilty and responsible for his death and later tells that he feels that way towards Lee on the train. Also his own son dying and having to deal with the results of that, and as well as the child in the attic not being able to deal with the loss of another child despite him not being his own. These three instances together further putting himself into this long spiral of guilt and remorse, which is why in episode 5 we see him trying to redeem himself of his guilt and remorse. Now there's two ways the story goes. You either have Ben in the group where Kenny decides to put himself at risk and save Ben, or you have Kenny try to save Krista trying to get the radio that they need to find Clementine. Both stories are very similar, which you have Kenny supposedly die saving another person in the group. Me personally, the not having Ben saving Krista fits better in terms of Kenny doing the action of risking his own life makes sense, but the route where you have Ben in the group and him stuck in the alleyway from the railing fits Kenny's overall development as a character. So for in terms of Kenny's character, we'll go over the route if he had been in the group still after Crawford. Lee and Kenny end up going down there to see if they can help Ben, but soon realize that Ben is impaled by one of the railings, and afterwards Kenny tells Lee to leave him to find Clementine. Lee obviously refuses, but Kenny locks himself out and goes on to prevent Ben to suffer by shooting him and escape from the alley. This whole scene of Kenny risking his life for Ben to potentially save him is all in the result in which he feels as though this is his chance to redeem himself, not letting another son die and step up as a father. And it's not just with the previous sons dying, but also the conversation that he had with Ben where Ben stands up for himself on what he's dealing with, and so with that also gives more of a reason as to why Kenny did what he did. The whole action more or less trying to forgive himself by doing something to prevent what has happened before. And the way the lines in that scene went were so great because it just added on to how great the scene was portrayed and how Kenny as a character developed. As far as that scene goes, that's pretty much the rest of what we get to see of Kenny, at least until season 2, which is where his character really gets examined. Now in season 2, we get to meet Kenny again after not seeing him ever since Savannah in season 1 at the ski lodge. Clementine and Kenny end up catching up with each other of what happened since then. After that, it seems that we see the normal Kenny again, which that doesn't end up being the case. From this point onward in the story, there are subtle and very apparent displays of Kenny not exactly being himself, as talked about from Sarita, Kenny's new lover. That not too long after Clem and Kenny's talk, that she asked Clem if Kenny seems different since she never knew anything about his life before meeting her.
Clem, I wanted to ask you, does Kenny seem different to you? I didn't know him before, and well, I'm curious. He has good days and bad days like everyone else. But lately I get the feeling he's struggling.
He does seem different than I remember.
In what way?
I'm not sure.
Well, you three have been busy.
Kenny, isn't it great?
I got it, hon.
I think I can manage, Ken.
I said I got it.
Which this comment, though it may seem small at first, really just gives you a fair warning on what's to come later in the season. The reason as to why Kenny is such a well-flawed character is the display of how human he is. What do you mean? Well, earlier I said how Kenny is a family man, a guy that would do anything to protect, provide, or anything to secure the well-being of his family. With that though, there have been cases where Kenny wouldn't confront the things that need to be dealt with, and so that lack of action practically cost him everything in season 1. With that same mindset of family to him, what made him lose almost everything again in season 2. He's afraid of what happened to his family in season 1 would happen to his loved ones in season 2. That's why you see Kenny be so adamant and aggressive of certain things, because he doesn't want to be alone again and leave that hole inside empty once again.
She was bit. I had to do it.
Fucking dare you, Clementine! It isn't gonna go like this.
Kenny!
I won't be left alone again.
I've heard a lot of different words people would use to describe Kenny in Season 2. One of the more popular words that keeps getting brought up is abuser, and I can see from a perspective as to why people would think that, as you can see that even towards the people that he cares about, he shows a lot of aggression from time to time as well as hateful verbiage. With that though, I wouldn't classify it as abuse or abuser because with Kenny I don't believe he's doing it on purpose. If there was a word that I would give to Kenny, it's broken. I could add on suffering as well, but the guy is broken.
I'm definitely starting to think we might need to branch out.
What do you mean?
Jane seems like the kind of person who gets tempered by hardship, you know? But when I look at Kenny now, he seems broken. Broken people get reckless. I know you got a history with him. Look, I think he's a good guy. At least started as a good guy. But I just think he's had to take more than he can handle.
I mean, really take a solid look on from the time we first meet Kenny up until the Kenny versus Jane fight, and really just witness what has happened since. Guilty of Sean Greene's death, and overall thinking that it was his fault that he died. His wife shoots herself for not being able to handle her son turning, then right after had to deal with putting his son out of his misery. Couldn't save Ben in the alleyway, spends about almost 2 years alone after the events of Savannah, and fast forward to Season 2, he witnesses his second lover die in the horror trying to escape house. And the way the story goes to where the majority of the group talk behind Kenny's back, saying to each other or even Clementine that Kenny is dangerous and that she should stay away from him because at any moment Kenny could just go absolutely insane. With this though, the whole idea for where the story was heading was to constantly remind you or give you a reason to slowly stay away from or perhaps permanently have Kenny not be present. It's easy to see from one perspective that Kenny's an asshole with all the actions he's done so far up, and overall think he's not a good guardian. But to really sit down and think of all that has happened to him to this point, you would soon realize that it makes sense as to why Kenny is the way that he is. With that though, it's also interesting with Kenny's relationship with Clementine because to be honest, she's the only one left that he can truly relate and vent to since she was there to witness all the things that they went through in Season 1. Even though they didn't talk that much to each other directly, the love and care towards each other was mainly transferred because of Lee. Lee still being a big influence between the two, mentioning multiple times of missing Lee and asking the question of what would Lee do.
They're scared of you, Kenny.
Well, if their big plan is to wander around in the woods, they ought to be scared of more than me.
Did you hear me?
We're all scared.
Look, we got maybe a day's worth of food for that kid left. That's it. Clem, think about Rebecca and Alvin. I mean, what if Lee hadn't gone tearing across half of Georgia looking for you? A lot of folks died to make that happen. A lot of folks died to get us this far.
Formula.
I don't know, but sitting around here ain't a way. I wish Lee was here. What you think he'd say?
To not trust anyone.
We can't just give up on this kid. I mean, what's the point of going on after that? That's what people like Lee knew, and what people like Jane won't ever understand.
And with what Lee did in Season 1, taking care of Clementine like she was his own child, and helping out Kenny's family, Kenny already adopted the idea of Clementine as family because of what she and Lee did for him in the last season, taking the hard hits mentally and physically, literally, to protect and care for Clementine. Now I know there may be people that say, oh, but there was plenty of characters where their families were gone or they lost loved ones and they're handling pretty well. One, on the outside, they may seem tough, but you don't know truly what they're dealing with on the inside. And two, who's to say that everyone is going to deal with grief in the same way? To be honest, the way that Kenny acts in Season 2 shows a very good portrayal of what someone like him would most likely do in his situation. That's why when you witness the fight between Kenny and Jane, it makes sense as to why Kenny gets so heated to the point where he wants to kill Jane. Not just because he thought that Jane killed AJ or left him to die, but with what happened with Kenny so far up until this point, AJ being perceived to be dead was the last straw because he doesn't want to lose any more people that he loves and cares about. In episode 5, there are multiple endings after the Kenny v Jane fight where you can either be with Kenny, Jane, Wellington, or alone by yourself. More specifically, I want to talk about a few scenes with Kenny. One where you shoot Kenny, leave him after finding out that AJ is alive, and 3 where he tells you to go to Wellington instead of staying with him. All of them are very similar in which all of them have Kenny say that he's not fit anymore to take care of the kids, as well as admit that he's going down a path that may lead to both Clem and AJ being in a dire situation or dead. I find this to be interesting because Kenny knew all along the way that this whole time that deep down he was going into a deadly spiral mentally. Really, the only thing keeping him sane was Clementine and eventually AJ in the later episodes. So he admits and humbles himself that letting them be in the care of someone else or separate from him in any way would be the best course of action. And though the ending of staying with Kenny all the way and seeing the results of that choice in Season 3 didn't do Kenny well, justice-wise, despite his flaws, he was still taking care of Clementine and AJ years after the events of Season 2. With this, I feel this is a great demonstration of how Kenny as a character is greatly flawed in a good way, being able to see the overall change that overcame him along the way and the self-reflect towards the end of Season 2.